thank you for being with us. We are most appreciative that you have applied for this most important advisory board. Each of you has a very impressive resume, and which we have read. And I, just so you know the format here, I'm going to ask the first question, and then each council member will ask one as well. We're asking that each applicant take no more than 2 minutes to answer each question, and I will let you know if you're going over your 2 minutes. Somebody last night thought I was giving them the peace sign, and I really wasn't. This was the look of what I'm trying to do. Don't want to interrupt, but you know, if we can just keep it to around the 2 minutes, and I'm going to rotate the order of who is answering the questions. You'll answer the first question, and then you won't have to answer another first question for, well, there's 5 of you today, so it'll go in rotation how that works. But I do ask the first question, and my first question is, please briefly describe why you want to become a member of the Policing Advisory Commission, and given your background and experience, what do you hope to accomplish as a member? And I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this so that the first person that we ask is Ms. Boston.
Okay, thank you. So I'm interested in becoming a member of the Policing Advisory Committee because as a social worker, I have worked very closely with crisis intervention officers. I've seen the impact that education and informative responses have on outcomes with regards to crisis management when someone is demonstrating behavior where they're decompensating, but it may be received as aggressive, or it may be they may be presenting as violent, but in reality they're manic. And so I've seen the impact, the positive impact that education has when police officers are trained, when there's a community alliance with mental health supportive services as well as law enforcement. And I've also seen the opposite happen when there aren't any opportunities for education, when people aren't trauma informed with regard to responding to mental health crisis. And so given my background, I think that I would be able to help to foster those conversations, regardless of how challenging they may be for some, and contribute to training and supporting continued education to support those efforts.
Thank you. The next question, the next person is Ms. DeRue.
Sorry, some technical difficulties. Good afternoon, everybody. So in terms of why I'm interested in becoming a member, I outlined this in my cover letter, and it continues to resonate today, which is I am the mother of 3 Black boys living in the United States, and specifically Montgomery County, and I have become increasingly alarmed to the point where I realized I can no longer sit on the sidelines and be disengaged out of fright, that I have to do something, and that something, the opportunity to do something came up with respect to this advisory committee membership. So I am worried and concerned about the society that they are growing up in and that they have to navigate in terms of high school, having police within the schools, in terms of walking on the street, playing in a playground. Basic items of that nature should not be cause for the level of concern that currently exists. I recently read an article by a sociologist named Ray Rashan, said that Black teenagers are 21 times more likely to be killed than their white counterparts. So that's the sort of statistic that has to galvanize any parent into some type of action. In terms of my background, I'm a lawyer. I'm a corporate securities transactional lawyer, but I'm also at a regulatory agency and have extensive experience in terms of policy and advising commissions And from that standpoint, I think my focus on data analytics and legal policy, trying to find the facts that support the best policy outcome, are areas that I thought I might be uniquely positioned to contribute to the work of the advisory group. So I don't have specific criminology background or sociology background, but I do believe that my approach as a lawyer and as a policy advisory person would be a contribution. And in terms of what I hope to accomplish, again, starting from the standpoint of data and policy and working with good facts, I would hope to look at ways in which we can address police issues of reform by addressing various policies or approaches to accountability that are data-driven and supported.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
Okay, that worked the first time. Afternoon. So my background is a little bit more systems and goodness of fit expertise, and so my interest in the Police Advisory Commission is largely that the police are ultimately a tool of government, and sometimes the training that they have and the tasks that they're assigned don't match up. Sometimes the way that we intend to use them and the way they get used don't match up. And having been on many sides of police encounters, growing up in the county, having lots of not exactly enforcement engagement with them, lots of social engagement since then, encountering them in advocacy, being friends with members of the forces, being involved in organizations that work with them. I've had an opportunity to see a lot of the different aspects and different angles and the different interplay between systems that govern not just police behavior, but sort of the whole public safety sphere or the public-facing aspects of government sphere. And the police are a very visible dimension of that, where it looks like there's an opportunity, especially in recent years as we've been looking at community policing and the debate over whether or not to keep them in the schools, the idea of how to better improve some of the implicit bias training, some of the more nuanced and social-focused uses. Having a background in both the systems and the psychology of it and having that direct experience with a lot of different players in that, I'd like to think that I might be able to provide a slightly different, perhaps a couple steps removed from the immediate fear, anxiety, and concern, but still being, very directly invested. Let's face it, I still look fairly fresh-faced, so I've occasionally been mistaken for something and someone that I'm not, and it's always a present thing, but it shouldn't be the primary thing. And I know that in the county and in some of the county's jurisdictions, we have a lot of people that are trying their best to find the right way, but they're not always reaching the right people, and I want to help bridge that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Price.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Councilman Katz, for that question. I am a proud MCPS teacher, Richard Montgomery High School, founder and coordinator of the Jaguar Scholars Leadership Program, which is devoted to empowering our students of color, particularly African American and Latino students. And the first thing when you asked that question I thought about was community. I think it's at the heart of everything. I think it's a privilege to be able to live in a community that I teach in and be able to get in front of the classroom and talk to students. Not only, lead them in instruction, but really engage them on issues that go far beyond the classroom setting. There's something that happens. I can go to school every single day with a shirt and tie on, but I'm very aware of the fact that when I leave my school and I'm driving down Rockville Pike, and if a police officer pulls up behind me, there's an emotion that comes on me, and I'm sure that there's a feeling that not only I experience as an African American man, but many other African Americans and people of color in this country. And I think that's why this commission is so important. It's why everyone on this call is stepping up to be a part of the work. And I'm ready for that. We live in a country that was founded on freedom as well as slavery, the irony of that. And so a lot of what we're living through right now is the legacy of that, the effects of that. And so I'm hoping, right, as a member of this commission, I'll be able to speak truth to power, right? Realize, recognize, and push in as much student voice as I can, as well as community voice, accountability, right? Holding folks accountable, right? If they don't know, right, maybe we'll spend some time educating. But, you know, once we know more, like Maya Angelou said, you know, when you know better, you do better. And so I think that's all a part of the work.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reed.
Good afternoon. Thank you first for the opportunity. My name is Justice Reed. My background that makes this applicable is, yes, I am a parent. Yes, I am a resident of Montgomery County. I'm also a kid who grew up in New York City. I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in the Bronx at a very interesting time where there was both the dichotomy of police brutality as well as the reality of many friends and family members who were police officers. And so I understand that delicate balance that they are trying to strike, but I also recognize the balance that we strike every day in trying to both police and serve our communities. From a background perspective, I am currently in sales at Microsoft, but particularly I've actually spent time working with police departments, specifically the NYPD as well as DC Police Department, supporting them in technological solutions that were originally intended for counterterrorism. And what I've learned in that time and in that approach is that we actually have the ability to leverage data and leverage different approaches that will allow us an opportunity to both understand situational awareness, which I believe can actually improve some of the challenge we face, but also we have an opportunity to leverage data and technology to help us better understand and better serve the community. Ultimately, what I want to get out of this is I believe that, like many of my fellow applicants, getting off of the quote-unquote sidelines and participating. I think it's really important that we as parents, educators, teachers, citizens jump in wherever we can. So I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the dialogue today.
Thank you very much. The next question that's going to be asked is by Vice President Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank all of you for making yourselves available to contribute to the county at such an important time. You bring a lot of skills to the table, and we're really glad to be interviewing you. Let me ask, Black Lives Matter is only the latest social movement challenging Americans to live up to the ideals in our founding documents. So how do you look at that movement, and how will that movement inform your actions as a member of the commission?
Thank you. The first person I'm going to ask to answer that question is Mr. Morris.
Okay. Well, that one's a little bit trickier. I am involved in a lot of different community groups and organizations, and we communicate pretty well across borders there. Black Lives Matter specifically, or the Movement for Black Lives, as their umbrella group is slightly better known, is largely about the idea of trying to get that accountability and transparency to that promise. And so in the dimension where it's focusing on making sure that there's both representation and accountability, and that there's transparency, and that there's some measure of equity that's not just built in, but intentionally focused on. We're in agreement and alignment on that. But as for a direct impact from some of their, say, statements or actions, it's really a matter of, are those members of the community that are coming out that want to participate in this conversation, do they have excellent examples from other parts of the country or other parts of the world that we could apply here, that we could adapt to apply here? And so they are a valued data source, but they are still just one of many data sources.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you for the question, Councilman Hucker. I mean, when I hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, I just look at it for what it is. I mean, why is it even a question, right? that we have to even say Black Lives Matter. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a world that was equitable, just, where Black lives did matter? I mean, the reality of it is that we live in a nation where that's not realized, it's not recognized. Folks have to speak to that and push for more accountability in law enforcement, for example. And so I'm in support, right, of any movement that would push to make sure we live up to our ideas, right, our vision, right, what we hope to be as a nation. I got goosebumps recently marching down Rockville Pike with my wife and students who, Richard Montgomery students who organized that, right, who stepped up to the plate. And so I could say more. I know my time is limited, but I'm fully aware of the realities of why it's even necessary. And I think it's a part of the work. It's a part of the work that we have to get to.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that it's influencing the dialogue right now. And I think it's also it's a catalyst for a lot of us to step up and to step into action. Because I think that we've seen things that unfortunately have become so commonplace that I think that the movement is galvanizing in a way that it's no longer acceptable, right? We see things such as violence against Black people. We see violence against children. We see violence, and it was getting to a point of oversaturation, and we dismissed it in ways. I think that the way I look at the movement, the way I look at what the movement and what the time right now is doing, is it's creating a dialogue for change. And I think that if we take in all of those different opportunities, those dialogues, if we actually take all the different stimuli that are happening right now, we take that and we actually boil it into a very focused effort for change, I think that it will be the movement that will have a lot of credit for it. And I think that the movement will galvanize a lot of us to actually question some of the things that we took as commonplace. So for me, what it means that it's getting a lot of people off of the sidelines into action. And I think that it's the responsibility of anyone to take that into account as we think about how we move forward as a society, specifically for the lives of, for me specifically, for Black children.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
So that is a loaded question. I'm going to try my best to answer it. One of the things that comes to mind, just to kind of reflect back on what Mr. Morris spoke about with regard to implicit bias, is a quote by John Powell, who is a professor at the School of Law at UC Berkeley. And he talks about one doesn't understand structures or systems by looking at the intent. Instead, we have to examine what they actually do, how they operate, what the outcomes are. And certainly a system or a structure can be established for the purpose of discriminating. However, most of them produce racialized outcomes without that intent. And so I think what has happened is that the conversations and the context has always been there. Things are happening more on the forefront. People are more comfortable being uncomfortable in having conversations. And there are so many different racial groups that are coming together to represent their disdain and their disregard and their disgust for the way that Black and brown people are being treated. And on the other side of that, there are those who are fighting so hard about making sure that people know that they don't want that change to happen. And so I think that growth, the biggest amount of growth comes out of conflict, and conflict is essential for growth. And so just being able to continue having those conversations, being able to continue to challenge people, to dig within themselves, to look within themselves deeply, to figure out what it is that they'd like to see, what outcomes would they like to see with regard to the relationship between community and law enforcement.
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
Thank you. I think following on what everyone else has pretty much said. I think by and large, Black Lives Matter, I view as a critical component and contributor to very necessary dialogue in this country. And I think it's also the case that from a timing perspective, it reflects fissures in our society that we should not be seeing. I mean, the movement was born of systematic and continuous violence and the dehumanization and devaluation of countless Black men who were being killed. And it got to the point where a simple phrase, Black Lives Matter, had to be showcased, and people began to galvanize around this. So I think for me, I think it's extremely important to the overall dialogue. I think it contributes to scrutiny, and that leads to accountability. It's a catalyst for us to recognize what is going on in our society, why it is that we have become somewhat detached sometimes from the brutality of what's going on, not just among Black communities, but as someone else pointed out, Black and brown immigrant communities. This movement has called us to scrutinize how we listen to, how we treat, how we hear and value the voices of those who are least able sometimes to speak or to be heard. So I personally think that there are many aspects about the movement that, we can debate, but its principal contribution is one, as someone else said, it's an excellent contribution to the dialogue that we have to have and continue engaging in.
Thank you. The next person to answer the next council member to ask a question is Councilmember Albernoz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank all of you. Your resumes are remarkably impressive, and your passion is even more impressive. So I just can't thank all of you enough for your interest. And as we've told other groups, this is going to be a really tough decision. And one of the bills that we have pushed forward and passed to address police reform was led by my colleagues, Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Rice last year, that worked to define community policing. And within the course of that public action and that bill process, I learned that community policing means very different things to different people. So I'd like to ask, what does community policing mean to you, and how would you define it?
Thank you. The first person to answer that question will be Mr. Price.
Thank you, Councilman Albernoz, for the question. When I hear community policing, I think about comfort, I think about belonging in an ideal world, right? If done right. I remember growing up and there was a detective who lived in our neighborhood, and just being able to know, right, navigating this world as a young Black man, that he also, as a Black man, being present, right, being visible, spoke volumes and meant a lot to me. It's speaking to the community's needs. It's recognizing that there's a problem and being willing to work through, locate, find solutions, right, that will benefit folks in the community, right, and not target them, right, at disproportionate rates, right. I think community policing, if done effectively, could really change the narrative. I think there are examples of it in history where we can see where it's just not happening. And hopefully in this role, I can be in a position where I push the conversation, the dialogue, where we push the accountability to the trust and the voice and have it recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
So thank you for the question. It's something that I've pondered myself. What does it exactly mean? For me, very specifically, what it means community participation. And community participation in the matters that would be considered overall policing matters, if you will, from a safety perspective, from a public safety, from a school safety, I think it's about participation of those community members and their participation to impact change and decide how they will be quote unquote governed, right? I recognize that there's broader government initiatives, but I do think that there's an opportunity for the different communities to actually come together and decide what's important, how will they operate as a community, and what are some of the standards, right? What are the things that we need to make sure there's different patrols around? What are the things that we need to make sure there are initiatives that we are launching? And I think that if we can get to an opportunity by which there are more participation, there's more of a shared contract, if you will, a shared social contract. That is how I would define community policing, because I think as the community bands together and the community comes together in a way that values all members of the community equally, treats everyone with fairness and equity, I think it provides a very unique opportunity for police officers to also then participate in a different fashion and in a different way to engage on other awareness and education opportunities.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
When I think of community policing, I think of a collaboration. I think of the police and the community almost being fluid. I think that it's important to normalize having conversations about mental health issues and making sure that in the event that someone's in crisis, that someone's trained to respond to those things. In DC, we have crisis intervention officers. And so anytime there's an FB12 or an involuntary committal to a psychiatric hospital, anytime someone's decompensating, we can request that a CIO responds so that the client gets the best opportunity at the appropriate care. And I think that as far as police officers in the community, that there should be an alliance. There should be, you look at one and you see the other. The police aren't just at the police stations or at the rec centers. They're in the churches. They're showing up at cookouts and community events, and they're playing basketball with kids, or they're playing football, or they're not just sitting behind a post and being looked at as authoritative figures, but they're being seen as people. And so when I think of that, I see more of a collaboration and enmeshment of relationship.
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
Thank you. When I think of community policing, I think of community empowerment. And that empowerment is principally based and would need to be based on a foundation of trust. So it means re-envisioning the way in which police departments engage with their communities, re-envisioning the way and creating policies that will foster greater trust as opposed to fear, so that you can have, and someone mentioned, this kind of fluid or more symbiotic relationship, but it's a relationship of respect in which the local community is allowed to a certain degree, handle issues by and large by themselves, knowing and being in the best place sometimes to do so if they're adequately resourced. But it's also one that will rely upon, as needed, proper and appropriate levels of engagement with a police force that they can trust. It's not a force that will swoop in. It's not a force that is going to overpower. It's a force that's more understanding and respectful of this kind of symbiotic relationship. So I view it as, if done and affected properly, community policing should be about empowering the communities, the local communities, by building, restoring trust. And you do that through programs, you do that through a variety of ways, but that's principally what I envision.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
So, echoing a couple of notes from some of the last comments, one of the things about community policing, as I understand it, is a lot to do with humanizing the police and humanizing the community members, because often when they only experience each other in moments of crisis, you see people at their worst and you only see that bit. But through some of that regular engagement, I believe Ms. Boston had mentioned, for example, having them out there playing with people and participating in cookouts. I know for Rockville, at least, we have officers that attend regularly most of the community association meetings, and they're there, yes, to provide a public safety update, but they're also there to be part of the community. They quite often live in those neighborhoods, or some of them, they used to live in those neighborhoods. They have familiarity with the place, with the people, and that idea of your police officer is a community resource, not necessarily a community monitor. And that's really the direction we should probably be nudging them, because we use them for a lot of things that aren't necessarily crisis issues or aren't necessarily strictly policing issues. They're not always public safety. Sometimes they're really in as mediators or as just an extra set of eyes or an extra set of hands. And if that's the role, then they need to be able to have an understanding of the community that they're in and operating in, but they also need to be known and trusted by those people that they're now working with, because ultimately they do still work for the people.
Thank you. The next council member to ask the question is Council Member Friedson.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you to everybody, each of you who has applied for this position. Among the over 200 citizens of the county who have applied, it's just been incredibly impressive and a testament to the amount of talent and expertise we have in the county and how much we will benefit and gain ultimately from this commission, although it is also a testament to how challenging our jobs will be. And this is going to be one of the tougher decisions that we have to make at a time when we're making pretty tough decisions on a fairly regular basis. So thank you for that. My question is about success and what you would determine success to be, both individually after your term would be up if you were selected for this Police Advisory Commission, and what would success look like for the group, for the commission itself, in terms of what actually could be accomplished and delivered from the group as a whole.
Thank you. First person to answer will be Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Council Member, for the question. I think that success is so hard when you're trying to kind of think about what are the things that you want to enact, right? You obviously want to save lives. You obviously want to protect people. I think also I would deem success to be if we're able to find approaches, if we're able to find programs, if we're able to define programs that become standards for others. That is how I would view success. I would view success as progress in that we are positively impacting the broader Montgomery County, Maryland, and then potentially thinking even bigger picture, are we able to say that we are developing a model and a system by which others can then piggyback and we can make the broader U.S. A better place? I think that success is challenging because, again, it becomes a question of how do you measure it, but I think you measure it from community sentiment. I think that if we're getting our people who are positively reacting, if they're positively experiencing, and if we're actually having different relationships with police, and sometimes that's, you can see that in the press, sometimes you can see that just in community involvement. I would deem that a success. I would deem it a personal success for myself if we're able to positively impact and we start to see even better traction just with some of our younger people and children and schools, and not needing necessarily the police schools, but can advise some of the schools and how we're doing. So those are some of my personal views on how we should measure success. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
So I think that because this is such a new conversation that's being had, I look at the success of even having their success in the fact that even 200 people have applied, and Montgomery County is in a position where we're even having these conversations. And sometimes success, especially in the type of work that I do, it's not quantifiable, it's qualitative. And so the quality of the relationships, kind of to piggyback on what Mr. Reed spoke about, the quality of the relationships and the relations between the community and law enforcement, as well as us being able to lay the framework for who, not sure how long the term would last, but whoever would come into the next round of the Policing Advisory Commission. I think that would be success from my perspective. Personally, just being able to be here and have conversations again about how do we improve our relationships with law enforcement. How do we hold folks accountable? What are some of the systems and the processes that we need to implement to make those things happen? So I feel like we're successful just sitting here at 5:10 this evening. So,
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
Thank you. So success for me would principally be centered around an outcome that would lead to us being able to hold police departments more accountable, for us to leverage data in a way where we would be in a position knowing that each of the initiatives that are put forth or suggested by the Advisory Commission, each of the outcomes in terms of the attempted policy changes are ones that are centered on accountability and are based on analysis of, and again, I don't know at this stage what programs, what data sets, but based on analysis that would lead us to outcomes that are measurable and that ultimately, though, would feed into some of the qualitative outcomes that we are hoping for. But I do think that success would be to move the debate and the narrative in towards a space that does leverage and respect the use of data and figuring out from that data what the best outcomes could be. So that in a nutshell, I think, would be the foundational principle around success, and it would be continue to be shaped, obviously, by the qualitative outcomes that others have mentioned.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
So at the risk of waxing just a little bit academic, one of the things is beginning with the end in mind, so starting with, all right, the entire purpose of this whole initiative and looking at how we conduct and hold to account and operate with the police and all of the other different aspects of the public-facing aspects of government is we want a society, or at least here a community or a series of communities that function better in the future than they do right now. And that looks like better equity, better relationship building, better mobility, better senses of, not just communal space, but communal existence. And so we want to take slices from each of these things and try and be able to pin some kind of gauge and some routine gauge, systematizing how we collect that information, even if it's a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. In fact, it should be a mix of both because both are very important. But at the end of a 3-year term, the commission is 3 years, right? At the end of a 3-year term, we might be doing well just to have an idea as to what some of those things look like, what some of the recommendations for the next crop should be. The pathways we don't want to go down will be easier to find than the ones that we do. And having that trove of, okay, here's what we've tried, here's what works, here's what doesn't work, here's what we're not sure about, here's where to go next. Having something in each of those boxes by the end of it, I would consider a personal and perhaps group success, just to have a clearer definition as to what it is we can do in pursuit of those goals that I think we all share.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Councilman Prieston, for the question. When I think about success, what does that look like for this commission? I think about my work in the classroom and, how do you know you've made an impact with the student? I mean, qualitative data, quantitative data is not always going to be the piece that stands out, right? Or is something that you could even point to, right? Or try to point to understand and realize your impact. And I think at the key and the heart of it, it's all about relationships. I know in the work that I do, and moving beyond that, it's almost as if there are, two worlds, law enforcement and the people, right? Too oftentimes people of color. And it's just this kind of back and forth, this tension of not really making the connection. And for me, at the end of this 3-year term, if we can switch, if we can change up, we can impact perceptions of children who are growing up, who grow up not fearing the police, right? Families not thinking twice, right, before they reach out to law enforcement, right, for a 911 call, right? If we could shift those perceptions and inform through our collaboration the structures that are in place, right, that aren't working, right, because we already know the disproportionate numbers that continue and persist all across the world, particularly in the United States. If we can inform that, I think that's success. Montgomery County, is a microcosm of the world. And so, if we can't get it right, here, right, why not here? Why not now? This is the place for it to happen. And so that's success for me.
Thank you. The next council member to ask a question is Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, all 5 of you, for spending your afternoon and evening with us and sharing your professional talents and your personal experiences with us. I appreciate that, and I know we all do. My question is this, and let me frame it. Earlier this year, when Chief Jones was before the council for his confirmation hearing, I shared with him the following statistic that I'll share with you. Since 2015, there have been 49 hate crimes reported in Montgomery County involving sexual orientation or gender bias, with a frequency that's only increased during that time period since, particularly against transgender women of color, many of whom have expressed concerns to me about their interactions with the police and their concerns and hesitations of doing so. So given these statistics, how do you think that your presence on this commission will help address the concerns of members of the LGBTQ+ community, and in particular trans women of color, when they all have to interact with the police after these unfortunate incidents?
Thank you. The first person to answer the question will please be Ms. Boston.
Okay, thank you. So I think that I know that I kind of attribute a lot of things to education and exposure. And I think that it's very important for those things to be extremely consistent. So perhaps inviting members of the LGBTQIA+ community to come and do some trainings for law enforcement, to create spaces and opportunities for there to be regular interaction and exchanges of dialogues around town halls, even around what some of those concerns are, and to get their perspectives on how they view how the responses that they receive from law enforcement. In those trainings, maybe perhaps making it a requirement, as we do here, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed spaces. We're required to do trainings annually so that we're up to date on best practices on how to be culturally competent when we're responding to things and when we're responding to certain populations. So I think that that would be important, to make sure that it's an inclusive environment where they're able to express themselves honestly without fear of any type of retaliation, but they're also able to kind of open up the space so that there's an exchange of information.
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
I think that it's extremely important for there to be, and this was just mentioned by Ms. Boston, but for there to be engagement and understanding, fostering understanding between any community that has typically been either devalued or misunderstood, and the police is, I think, at the heart of what the Police Advisory Committee should be doing. And how you go about it, the means by which you go about it, we will need to be creative, but at the end of the day, the outcome is what's most important, and that would be to humanize populations that are typically misunderstood. And again, a lot of it is through community events, and it may be through things like town halls. And it may be through opportunities to speak one-on-one with people who have suffered negative consequences at the hands of the police, and understanding and working through what happens, when does it happen, what does the data show us, where do these sorts of issues arise with respect to the LGBTQ community. How is this engagement between them and the police not working, and how can we address those gaps or those errors? So I think, again, it starts with engagement. It leverages information that can be and should be collected regarding how the community is being treated, and it should end with outcomes that are more inclusive and that are ones that will foster better relations.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
So this one might be harder for me to keep to 2 minutes, but in brief, in my capacity as the co-chair of the Public Safety Advocacy Committee Task Force with the Queer Dems, we're actually in the process of having communications with several police departments about setting up a slightly different kind of community engagement, where it's the affected members of the community themselves reaching out for sort of a Q&A and an informal liaison with different officers that have expressed interest in understanding, and some of the community engagement divisions, where we're inviting them to come in and hear stories from what people have experienced, what people's concerns are, the fears that they maybe bring with them. Montgomery County has a very large number of people that live here but grew up somewhere else, and sometimes the experiences they've had there make them not only less likely to seek help from the police, but make them a little more, not necessarily combative, but I guess cagey would be a way to describe it, when they do interact with the police here, and that doesn't help either them communicate clearly or the police respond appropriately to their needs. And so what we've been working on is trying to finesse how to create that environment where people that maybe don't feel comfortable having that direct communication can use other members of their community that they do trust to reach out and to have those stories and experiences heard and addressed, and to get that feedback, and to try and create the dialogue that way. Obviously, it's a lot, and we have just gotten that ball rolling in the last couple of months. The recent crisis has upended everyone's plans, but I will hopefully be able to report back to the commission or to interested council parties or anyone else on this call as we figure out how to better manage that. But that is a thing that I've spent a lot of time in the last few months working on directly.
Thank you. And you came in under 2 minutes. That's impressive. So, Mr. Price, please.
All right, thank you for the question, Councilman Glass. It's my belief that no person in this county should have to walk around in fear and not have a place, not feel like they have a place or a sense of belonging, being a part of the community, right? And so I think the work is, and I think Ms. Boston mentioned this earlier, is creating the space for folks to feel welcome, right? Folks who are brothers and sisters who are from a wide range of communities, right? Particular trans and LGBTQIA communities, right? Having a space where they can speak their truth, right? Be heard by folks who are in these positions of power, right? Law enforcement in particular, and being engaged, right? Their humanity, right, is front and center. And I think a lot of understanding through community events, town halls, for example, I think could go a long way. But I think it's a part of the work. And I think that we need to, as a body, right, send a strong message in terms of where we stand, right, standing for all people, right, and being clear about that, and advocating for folks, being the allies, right, that we would want others to be for us. I think that's at the heart of this.
Thank you. And Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Councilmember Glass, for the question. I think it's interesting. I've had a recent experience with a colleague who has transitioned at work. And what that did for me is it actually kind of opened my eyes to not only make sure that I was educated, but are we educating others on behalf of that person? person, right? And again, this is not to take their voice away, but if we amplify that voice and if we support our community and we support them in a way that actually kind of spreads out the conversation, I think that I would agree with what everyone has said, but I think that the one thing that I would also make sure is that we created the dialogue by which the police is being educated, but we're also creating the dialogue in which the police is doing some of the education to our citizens. I think that if we consider some of the things that, we might remember back in the day where there were ads running about domestic violence and, make sure that we're checking on other people. And we created a consciousness in the community of what was acceptable and what was not, right? And we created a consciousness that we had to even check after, whether it be women, people of color, children. We're all mindful of it. We're thinking about it now because we've created that awareness. I think creating that awareness and creating that dialogue and creating that connection that these are people that live right next door to you. They're citizens just like you. There is no difference. And break down the barriers of what we might perceive to be different, and we start to see them. I think it will actually amplify the conversation. I think the police can play a part in that, in actually driving that dialogue on the citizens' behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. The next council member to ask the question will be Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to each of you for applying. I agree with my colleagues. This has been a joyful exercise, but also it's going to be very difficult to pick between such a great group. Little preamble to my question. We've all been very good. I hope it continues, of asking the same question of everybody so we can compare it. Just a few weeks or months ago, we as a council I drafted a resolution, and everyone supported, and we declared racism a public health emergency here in Montgomery County, based on a long history of, as has been mentioned by some of you in your answers, a recognition that this country was founded on a system of chattel slavery that necessitated the dehumanization and anti-blackness of a people that has extended to so many. We've been talking about some of those groups, and a caste system that was set up to build this economic powerhouse that is the United States, but also very unequal and inequitable, and produces uneven outcomes, but also death. And one of the things embedded in that resolution was that racism literally causes death in many ways. And one of those ways, and one of the most pernicious and pronounced ways, is through state-sanctioned violence, police violence. And that's what has led to this moment. The power we vest in our police to take life, to detain, and to deprive liberty is an awesome power, but one that has been misused, and why we are at this moment where we are. And we're not immune, obviously, here in Montgomery County. When you look at the data, over half of the people arrested in 2018 here in Montgomery County were black, despite representing about 19 or 20% of the population, African Americans. 55% of the people whom had force used against them in 2018 were black. If you add Latino residents, you get up to over 75% of the population. We see similar disparities. Half of the students arrested in schools over the last 4 years were black students. So my question to you is, with that preamble, do you believe that the system of policing as set up and operated here in the United States, and in particular in Montgomery County, is a racist system? And if so, why? And what do we do about it? And if not, why?
Thank you. The first person to answer the question will be Ms. DeRue.
Thank you, Council Member Jawando. In short, I do think that the system of policing that has been established within the United States, given its historical legacy, and particularly within Montgomery County, is one that produced racist outcomes. Whether I would cast generally judgment on the entire system, at this stage, I would say it's not entirely racist, but its outcomes are definitely racist. And as one of the other interviewees mentioned, sometimes you have to look at the outcomes in order to address, in essence, the process, in order to address the system. if we are seeing outcomes that disproportionately and consistently result in the death of Black and Brown and immigrant communities at far larger proportions than white counterparts, if we're seeing outcomes that result, again, in people living in fear solely because of the color of their skin, these are all outcomes that suggest that the entire system needs to be revamped and reassessed. How you do it, I think, is why we are all here. I think that we do need to, again, and I know I may sound like a broken record, but I do think we need, in order to move any type of policy change, you have to be starting from a basis of facts. So you look at all of these disproportionate outcomes and you see areas that have to be addressed, and you implement policies that can address and result in reductions of police violence by specified percentages, for example. And you use this information to craft legislation that can have an impact on the types of protocols and policies that can be implemented. And that in that way, sorry, you address the issue.
Thank you. I was going to say, you certainly are welcome to finish your statement. Thank you.
And we know these aren't easy questions to answer, so.
The fact that you can do it within 2 minutes is impressive every time. The next person is to answer, please, is Mr. Morris.
Okay, so is the policing system itself racist? Dubious, because one of the problems is it's not just the police, it's also the laws that they're supposed to be enforcing, the people to whom they respond. The society itself has a lot of racist assumptions and underpinnings, and there is an unfortunate overlap between race and poverty or relative deprivation that exacerbates all of these other things. So whether or not the system itself is where the outcomes obviously are is kind of difficult to parse when you take into consideration the other pieces at play, but it can't really be done in a race-neutral capacity either because of those impacts being so outsized to the percentage of the population. And so while the system itself may not be inherently and incurably racist, there has to be some consideration for the way that these different behaviors, these different policies, these different expectations and parameters will affect based on race. And I think this was part of the idea behind the racial equity and social justice bill that went through late last year as well, is that there's this mess that we have inherited from previous generations going back to the country's founding and have been disentangling bit by bit. And so I don't know that it's helpful to think of it as the system being racist for just the policing bit, but to look at the ways that we can mitigate the impact and, as Mr. Wu was just saying, to track that impact to find out where the mitigation is most necessary.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Councilman Joanna, for the question. Oftentimes when I think when people, hear a question like that, they oftentimes go to individuals. And it's not about individuals, it's about systems that are in place. Currently, I'm teaching a class on DC history. And just this week, we were going over a lesson on redlining and what that means in this country. And I had one student in particular, I never forget, a white student who said, "Mr. Price, I can't believe this. Like, my whole education, I'm getting ready to graduate high school, and I never knew this history. I never knew the story. Like, Black people were really denied access to credit, right, to loans, right? It's why you drive in neighborhoods today, and they're heavily dominated by certain populations, right? Racist systems need to be undone, right? And the system of policing, Montgomery County public schools, I think roughly are 20% African American, right? But when you look at SROs, right, arrests that are made, we're about 50%. That's a policy, right? There are structures in place that are allowing that to happen, right? And we have to undo that in order to advance the work.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
I think the system has to acknowledge its racist roots. And I think in acknowledging the history and the past of how we got to the place we're at today, I think that does have to acknowledge that there is some parts of the system that have been rooted in racist policies, approaches, and guidelines that is the reason why we're here today. And I think if we at least acknowledge, right, that's the first step, is let's not deny and say everything is perfect. Let's acknowledge the problem and then discuss the ways in which to amend, fix, adjust. And the amendments, no pun intended, are intended to adjust for things that we did not take into account at the time and we have better knowledge of now. And I think that that's the dialogue that we have to continue right now. If I think about some of the things that we, people would say the Constitution has been amended, has been fixed several times over, and will continue to be, because there are things that we've acknowledged as wrongs that have to be righted. And the way I would look at it and what we need to do is we need to continue the dialogue and leverage the inputs that are coming in. We have an understanding of the statistics of what's happening, and we probably need to take an even more aggressive approach to adjust and reverse. I think that we have to educate our police officers that they may be creating a vicious cycle. If I continually arrest the same kid over and over again, no surprise that as he grows up to be a criminal, because we keep putting him back into a system. We keep putting her back into a system. And so I think that if we acknowledge and we then try to correct and try to build more neutral policy that acknowledges the past, we can move forward in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
I would just like to reflect as well on the history of policing, the institutional racism that it was founded on. You think about the slave patrols that were in place in the 1800s, where they had carte blanche to go anywhere in any of the southern states and go into people's houses and hunt slaves down. They were white volunteers who were empowered by vigilante groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. They were funded by a lot of folks who shared similar thoughts about slaves and the capturing of slaves and slaves being treated as property. And then you move into the Black codes and Jim Crow, and how folks, Black folks were only able to work in certain areas. They were only able to eat in certain areas. You think about segregation, and you think about how those laws were established to make sure that the police were able to reinforce things based on race. And so I do definitely think that there is a strong reference and a strong foundation with regard to racism. I think the fact that we're having the conversations now is important so that people are able to acknowledge, again, like so many of you have already said, you have to be able to acknowledge that that exists. And once you acknowledge that it's there and it's been there, and that's what the foundation kind of holds, then you're able to move forward. And I think that we're able to have those conversations. I don't think that they're going to be comfortable for people, but I think that as you're having them and you're having them more regularly, and you're able to accept that certain things were created out of institutional racism, then you'll be able to figure out where it is that you'd like to see change.
Thank you. The next council member to answer ask a question is Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful afternoon. I am so pleased that all of you decided to apply to this particular committee. Each and every one of you has brought a breadth of insights and really important and timely contributions to this process itself. So I am just so excited. At the same time, I also want to acknowledge, as a point of personal privilege, that as people of color, these kinds of processes and conversations and having to answer these questions and analyze all of this just takes a toll after a while. At least for me, it does. because we're trying to integrate not just a theoretical issue, but also a very personal issue. And so I commend all of you for coming to this moment in such a generous way with all of your insights. It's absolutely true. Some of you have talked about the need to look at this from a systemic perspective. And that's why for me, given that this was going to be my last time being council president, working on the racial equity and social justice law was fundamental. I knew that unless we engaged in this process and finally end the process adopting this law was incredibly important, because as some of you have said, we can't isolate something like the policing in the United States and look at it from the perspective of it being racist without acknowledging that many of the laws that they were told to enforce were inherently racist in order to maintain a system that has led us to this particular moment in time. And so it's also connected. It's redlining, it's housing, it's healthcare, it's everything. And the pandemic has just completely put this front and center for all of us. So on the one hand, I am so, in awe of the fact that timing was everything and we were able to do all this work last year. So in that way, Montgomery County is very fortunate. On the other hand, wow, is there work to do? So I say that to thank you for stepping up. But the question that I've asked every applicant thus far has to do with obviously, us being really a microcosm of the country and the world. Montgomery County being really the face of our global community, right? And so when you look at the statistics in MCPS, for example, having 157 countries, more than 150 languages spoken, I mean, it's just amazing. Taking that into consideration, realizing that we do have so many complexities even within many of our communities. We'd love to throw terms like the immigrant community, or even the Latino community, or the Latinx community, or the Caribbean community, the Black community. Does the Black community include people from continental Africa, the Caribbean? There's just so many things that go into that. But given this beautiful complexity, if you are appointed to this particular commission, thinking about this issue of policing and enforcement and public safety, what would be right off the bat the three top things that when you go in there you'll be looking for in order to start working on this broader issue? What would be those top three things that you kind of go in and say, gotta take care of these like right away, and this is urgent?
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
Okay, well, one of my first things would be establishing some kind of digital or quasi-automated pipeline for community input so that they don't have to come out to town halls to tell us what they think. Something as simple as having a form that they can just submit thoughts or testimonies, or a place that they can email things to and have a way to sort through that would be an excellent way to get information from some of those smaller groups that it doesn't necessarily make sense to set up an event just for, until you know what they need and how to reach them. One of the other things sort of on the heels of that would be setting up the county police department, if I remember correctly, does a lot of community engagement by way of like coffee with a cop kinds of events, but having them tied to, when we can get back to in-person affairs, tied to coming out to things where it's more of an open invitation and less of a formal structure for some of that dialogue that you were talking about a few questions ago. And of course, all of that information is great, but unless there's a thing in place or a framework being built to process it and how to prioritize and how to act on and how to incorporate that into considerations, all the data you collect in the world isn't very useful. So that would be sort of a tandem, but item number 3.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you for the question, Councilwoman Navarro. So the first thing would be voice, community voice, specifically student voice, right? Making sure that they don't just on paper have a voice, but it's realized, it's recognized. And so giving students that opportunity to know that, it goes back to the data point that I mentioned earlier, right? These students are living these experiences, right? When you're put out of class, right? We talk about implicit bias, right? All the time. What is that experience like? And how can we move beyond that and not target particular populations? Another thing is accountability, right? Once we have the data, right, let that data inform how we move forward as a group, right? In regards to creating and building new policies, more equitable policies. And then last but not least, trust, relationship building. I'm a big believer in that. I think it informs the work, right? How are we moving beyond our four walls and engaging the community, right? From our young students, right, to our longtime residents. I think that's at the heart of the work.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
So I first of all, thank you. And I'm in awe at the complexity, and not because I don't know, but to hear it articulated, I feel it. But even for Councilwoman such as yourself to articulate it also kind of makes me kind of pause and say there's probably also a lot I don't know. And what I don't know, I would strive to learn. I would strive to listen to principals. I think that they have a pulse on the student population. I would strive to kind of understand what measures this council has already taken to make sure that I'm fully informed, and I really have an appreciation for the work that you've all done. And then I'd also want to understand what police officers and their leadership are proud of. What are the things that they've already launched? What are the things that might not be in the news? Because that's always the catch. Did it make the news or not? And sometimes the news has to focus on selling more clicks, right? So you don't always hear some of the positive stories. What are the things that we can enhance and expand upon? I would want to do that education and understanding, because I think if you're focused on parents, principals, police officers, understanding their narrative and their story, I think we can start to augment the story and then figure out how we continue to expand upon it. I would not come at it assuming that a lot of work is not being done. I know that there's a ton of work being done. I know that every single member of this council is spending countless hours on it. But how do we kind of understand that work and then think about how we expand upon it if possible? So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
So it's kind of where I am now. I work with families who are going through trauma, and as a program manager, you don't want to come in and upset too much balance immediately. Sometimes you have to, for me, I come in and I want to listen. I listen actively. You look at the strategic plans. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And it's always been important for me to listen to the people, listen to my clients, listen to the families, listen to the community, the concerns that are coming from the community, the stakeholders, so that we can then develop a process, develop policies that will enhance the community, that will enhance the collaboration, that will enhance the conversations. And so for me, that would be where I would want to start. I'd want to listen to what the concerns were. I'd want to look at where we are, where we want to be, and then look at the policies and the processes that we need to establish to get there.
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
I think the three principal goals I'd aim to achieve would be to find, educate, and incorporate. Find, I think, Councilwoman Navarro, thank you for the question. You raise an excellent point. There are so many complexities within just Montgomery County. And personally, I think one of the starting points would have to be, who do you speak to? Who speaks for which community? And have you identified within the community the correct spokesperson or spokespeople? So I think you have to find, first of all, these communities with whom you need information and who you need to engage. The second one would be educate. I think a lot I'm an immigrant. A lot of the historical background in terms of the United States racist history and systemic racism is something that I'm learning. But I think, like other immigrants, it's useful for you to not assume everyone is starting from the same baseline. Educate and then find out how racism is differentially impacting a particular community, and hear their stories so that you have a starting point in terms of work that's to be done. How I'm impacted as a Afro-Caribbean woman is different than how an Ethiopian man might be impacted. But these are real stories. And then the last is to incorporate. I think if we're looking at ways to inform or educate police and policing policies, we would then have to incorporate that information into revised policies on police engagement.
Thank you. The next council member to ask a question will be Council Member Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Council President. And as my colleagues have said, the hour's getting late, but the accolades should not stop. In terms of how great each and every one of you are, we are truly blessed to have such great people who want to serve on this commission and make our community a better place. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump in. We can't ignore the legitimate concerns and criticism that some of our students and other members in the school community have about all forms of law enforcement and their presence in our schools. By understanding that students who may bring guns or knives to our schools, or those who may bring in large amount of drugs into our schools, can be arrested by police officers regardless of whether there's an SRO at the school or not. Do you think that a well-trained school resource officer that operates more like a counselor or an educator, working with students to diffuse peer-to-peer and peer-to-teacher conflict and helping to address issues such as drug or alcohol abuse, should be in our high schools?
Thank you. The first person to answer the question will be Mr. Price.
Thank you, Councilmember Rice, for the question. I think there's so much to say when we talk about education, what happens in the classroom, how it's oftentimes a reflection of the evils that happen in the world. I mean, they tend to creep in interactions for lack of understanding. I think to get to the point about SROs, I think the stats, the data is there. And I think we should reimagine, right, the role, as you point to, right? What does it mean to be an officer within a space where you have students who are vulnerable, right? Who are the first, right, to be oftentimes targeted, right? The presence of someone who is possibly in a counselor role, right? Because, I mean, not just the school I teach at, but schools all across the country, right? Just don't have the staff to support the population of students in which they serve. And so how can we, I guess, reimagine the role of the SRO, right? And put them in a position where they're empowering students, right? And walking step by step with them, opposed to kind of this us versus them relationship, which I think tends to dominate the day-to-day realities.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
I believe that we should look at all solutions in the same light that we would look at it for any affluent school district, any affluent neighborhood. And the way that we would want those children who grew up in, just because it was a television show, Beverly Hills, I want the kids in Montgomery County treated the same way. I don't think we would stand for police and the criminalization of kids in Beverly Hills, so we shouldn't stand for it here. So that's my soapbox for just a second, sorry. But I think that if we take that universal approach to children, to kids, and we take the universal approach to what we believe children need, and we will all acknowledge that the laws protect children to say they are not of mind and they are not of age yet, so there are protections that we afford them, then it should be completely decriminalized. So the way that that needs to be enacted is that we need to consider aggressive counseling and aggressive support, and also consider that we might have to take an opportunity to take a step back and prioritize our budgeting. If we prioritize our budgeting in a way that decriminalizes the schools, you might actually see student affluency go up, you might see student achievement go up, and we might actually be better off overall as an overall society. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
So I absolutely am for having SROs who are able to de-escalate situations and almost take a position of guidance counselor, social worker. You know, the responses are person-centered, they're strengths-based, and it definitely contributes to the relationship between or the presentation of law enforcement and the family. In addition to that, I think that some kids may react or respond the way that they do because they don't necessarily want to be in school. They may have IEPs, or they may have 504 plans. They may not be getting the support that they need in school. There may be things that are going on at home. And so having an opportunity to open up those spaces so that parents can feel more supported, because there may be things that are going on at home that the kids are using school as a way to get away from, but they really don't have the ability to navigate. You know, they may have a learning disability, or they may not be reading on grade level. And so having an additional opportunity for a professional response, someone who's been law enforcement, someone who's educated in some of these interventions, I think would be extremely beneficial to the school and learning environment.
Thank you. Ms. DeRue.
Thank you. I think, like others, I think if you focus on changing the SRO role, you will change the function. So you have to change the role that they're playing now, move it from its current confrontational, almost militaristic stance to one that shifts to, and again, as others have said, one that shifts to one in which you're engaging these children, because you're in a school and they're fundamentally children, engaging children in a consultative capacity that's nurturing their development and lessening potentially the psychological trauma that children will have if they're consistently faced with SRO officers that are acting more like cops as opposed to counselors. So I definitely think that there is room for changing the role. I think that once you do that, the entire mentality and perspective shifts, and that you will benefit overall in terms of how these children are being nurtured and supported and guided, and in how they are shielded from some of the premature kind of criminalization of some activity as simple as going to school. We have to move away from that type of a model. And I think it starts with changing the function of the SRO.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
So I'm going to take a slight departure. 20 some odd years ago when I was a kid at Richard Montgomery High School, one of my favorite faculty members or favorite staff members was actually one of the security guards. And his job was primarily to break up fights, to confiscate contraband, and to keep track of people to make sure that everybody got back to class. Fast forward, I have nieces that are graduating from RM last year, this year, next year. And I find that the experience they've had has also been that sometimes the non-faculty, like the non-teaching staff, are sometimes some of the best resources they have in that building. And so if the SRO is trained in some of those social work and those soft interventions and isn't being weaponized by other members of faculty, because remember, it's not just the officer themselves, it's who's asking the officer to carry this kid out of class? Who's asking the officer to file a report? If the officer in question, as I understand it, they volunteer for this, they take on additional training for this, they want to be in there, they want to work with kids, and most of them that I have encountered and spoken with not only relish it, but they really do invest in helping those kids grow, in helping them succeed, and helping them progress. So if that is the model, and that is the kind of intervention that we're having, we need more of that. Now, if we have those SROs that aren't doing this, they need to be stripped of that position quickly because they are being counterproductive and quite possibly damaging. But if the SRO model works in the schools, just crazy idea. It might work in the community as well, that they are there, again, as I said much earlier, as a resource, as opposed to not necessarily a threat, but let's face it, the police are kind of the stick in the carrot and stick of law and management and order.
Thank you. The last question of the evening will be asked by Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. I'm also thrilled by the conversation and just enjoy the vibe of talking to you and the prospect of having a table where residents can take community leadership to engage on really difficult topics. And thank you. It's really fulfilling. I have said I want to thank my colleagues on the council for approving this legislation, which I introduced after the shooting death of Robert White. It was seeking to bring the community and police closer together. And that's going to mean uncomfortable conversations, because if you're not having an uncomfortable conversation, you're not making progress. You're not having that exchange that you have to understand one another and maybe recommend something that's represents change. So I'm getting a lot out of this. Wanted to ask you all, if each of you, is there any additional policy issue that you wanted to just highlight of something of interest to you that you think we need to address? This commission certainly is intended to engage the community. At the same time, its purpose is to focus on policies because policies of the department are how the community ends up experiencing policing. How officers are directed to do their job is often how that job is then experienced. So, there's a lot there, top to bottom. Are there any particular policy issues that you would like to just say you think are of greater importance?
Thank you. The first person to answer the question will be Mr. Reed.
First of all, thank you, Councilmember Reamer. It's a tough question because there's so many issues that are particularly important. I think for myself, and I'll speak very personally, I think what I am, very interested is also making sure that we very careful and thoughtful about how we consider hate crimes, how we consider the hate speech, how we consider kind of even racist graffiti that I know has been tagged on certain high schools recently. I think that why I'm concerned about that in particular is I think it creates a view of, are we accepting of some of those things as a community? Are we policing ourselves and policing the broader expectation that that's unacceptable? I think that it's such a challenging environment right now, kind of with the top of the country's leadership engaging what is hate speech in a lot of ways. But it creates a environment where I am concerned for our children's safety if some of those things are allowed to go unchecked. How do we do that is hard. And I think it's a challenge. I think what we have to do is we have to make sure that we have legislation and we have policing and we are policing that just as hard as we are other crimes. Just because it was potentially a white kid who graffitied Walt Whitman High School and had racist graffiti that was tagged on the walls, it is just as bad as some of the other things. And unless we start to have that same approach and that same rigor, we're going to be challenged. So that's my personal view of the situation. Excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boston.
I am a little caught off guard, I'll be honest with you, Councilmember Reamer. I'm not, I haven't reviewed all of and there are quite a few.
I didn't mean to set that bar. A very general question. Are there any particular issues that you think we ought to really make sure we tackle? That's really, it's very easy, I hope.
I think
Ms. Boston, I'll reset your 2 minutes, please.
Okay. I think that this is a extremely important one, and so the fact that we're having these conversations now, I think that as we are being thoughtful in how we move forward with the Policing Advisory Commission, there will be a lot of things that will probably come out of this. There may even be the birth of new policies and procedures, opportunities for additional areas to be included under that umbrella.
Thank you.
Yep.
Ms. DeRue.
Thank you. So I think in terms of an area that there's room to address, I would identify, and it goes back to where we started, this notion of community policing through community empowerment. I think an area that we need further study on is how we can use the budgetary resources that we have to support within each of our communities policies, programs that might actually help empower the communities and fundamentally change the way in which these communities are engaging within and amongst themselves, as well as vis-a-vis the police. I think that from the standpoint, again, of looking at what is being done now, what is working, are there workforce programs that are set up within communities? Are there educational kind of tutoring programs between members of the police and members of local schools? But what are policies that are deemed to be or shown statistically to be effective? And how can we get resources to support those types of policies? That might be an area I think that I would be interested in the commission pursuing or considering.
Thank you. Mr. Morris.
So, two things here. One kind of low-hanging fruit and one much higher up on the branch. The low-hanging fruit would be looking at some of the programs that we already have in place and maybe reevaluating some of their intakes. I know that it's been a conversation in some cases where access to services that a person should technically qualify for because of the paperwork they have to fill out to access them, or because of the things that are required for them to provide in order to access, precludes them from getting the help that they need, even though the county has a program that, on the face of it, is available to someone in their situation. And while it's not an intentional thing, it does tend to more frequently negatively affect people whose first language isn't English, people who have non-standard, by which I mean they don't have a 9-to-5 kind of job or they don't have W-2 employ. Those types of things have an impact in the communities in question and are things that we can just make mostly modest adjustments to improve uptake and accessibility for the supports that are already there. High branch. By extension, some of the laws, like the misdemeanors and some of the rules that are already on the books, need to be reviewed to see whether or not we want to keep them, whether or not they still make sense in the modern context, whether or not their equity impact is such that maybe we should have scrapped them 30 or 50 years ago. I was having conversations with a couple of folks with the delegation to Annapolis about doing this at the state level. I understand that a lot of the stuff in the county jurisdiction is kind of tied to what the state does, but there are some things that here in the county we could probably take a look at, and those are often also things, sometimes nuisance laws, that they get enforced, or they get used as an excuse for enforcement activities where one would not otherwise take place. And if you take those out of the equation, you leave it so that the enforcement activities take place for the things that we really do care about, that really do matter, and you reduce the opportunity for the potential for abuse for some of these other things that we've seen.
Thank you. And the last answer for the evening will be Mr. Price, please.
Thank you, Councilman Reamer. I think to your question, I keep thinking about the recent protest that took place on Rockville Pike. And the 3 young ladies, Richard Montgomery High School ladies, who had the audacity to believe that their voices could be heard, right? They had no idea, right, that hundreds of people around their community would come together and march, right, in the name of Black Lives Matters, right? And the countless men and women who have lost their lives. I think COVID-19 exposed what's already been there, right, for many, many years. And the big takeaway from that moment is that the students know there's a problem. Their parents know there's a problem. Their grandparents know there's a problem. It's generational. And the work that I'm interested in is pushing for our community, students in particular, to recognize that they have a voice in this democracy, a democracy that their ancestors built.
Thank you. Well, as has been mentioned several times this evening and in other interviews as well, each of you have given us one difficult situation for us. And we, this council candidly deals with some difficult situations, but this is in one way, it's a wonderful problem to have. On who to select for this commission. It's not a wonderful problem that we need the commission, but it's a wonderful problem that we've had so many people who are so very well qualified, and really the conversation has been just unbelievably interesting for all of us. So I thank you for applying. Our goal, and I underline that it's a goal, is to actually vote on and have people on this commission by the end of this month, that we would actually vote on the people who will be on it. We're on track. We have one more set of interviews on Friday, and hopefully everybody can show up so we can do them and keep on track. But that is our goal. We hope to have the commission up and going right after, I guess, fall, by the time everything gets started. So that's where we are. And we thank you very, very much for being involved. And we ask, even if you're not appointed to this commission, please stay involved with us. So with that, we thank you for being with us this evening, and we are going to adjourn. Good night, and be well and be safe.
I heard about it online, looking for places to come eat outside. Girls needed to get out of the house. It's great.
So